Hi, everyone. Hi, thank you for joining today's webinar, The Rise of EV Misinformation and How to Tackle It. I'm Keri McNamara. I'm Manager of Reports and Outreach at Clean Energy Canada. For those of you who don't know us, we're a think tank at the Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, BC, located on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So first, just some housekeeping while folks are connecting in. If you have any technical questions, you can ask them through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and my colleague, Kira Torrance, will provide support. We'll be welcoming your questions in the final 30 minutes or so of this webinar. You'll be muted though, so please submit your questions through the Q&A icon. And please feel free to ask questions anytime. We'll be compiling them for later. And finally, we'll circulate a recording of this webinar and a copy of the slides to all who registered. Please feel free to share them widely. We'll also include a link to Clean Energy Canada's awesome weekly newsletter, which you should totally sign up for if you haven't already. So down to business. I think almost 700 people registered for this webinar, which I think speaks to the level of concern about the issue. It's no secret that we're in an age of climate misinformation, driven largely by social media, but the dominant kind of misinformation is shifting. So a recent study of more than 12,000 climate-related YouTube videos posted since 2018 found that old-fashioned climate denial, it's the old global warming is fake narrative, has been replaced by a denial of solutions. So while straight up denying that climate change is happening has declined by a third, videos discrediting climate solutions like EVs has more than tripled. The shift comes actually amid an impressive few years for EV adoption. Last year's climate action report from the World Resources Institute, which assessed 42 kind of sectors or indicators on climate progress, found that the EV sector was the only one on track to meet its 2030 target. So EVs now make up 16% of electric vehicles sold online. Electric vehicles sold worldwide, and in Canada that number is 12%. BC, which is the Canadian leader, is closer to 23%. So importantly, not only did the absolute number of EVs sold in Canada last year increase, but so did the growth rate. So essentially, demand for EVs is growing quicker than it has in previous years. So on the surface, it's a good news story about a popular climate solution taking hold. But the way that EVs are presented to Canadians is increasingly negative. And it's about more than just algorithm-driven misinformation. It's also about the news coverage EVs receive. So just to be clear, this is not necessarily the product of bad intentions or bad incentives, but of the mechanics of and the mechanisms of journalism, of what makes news and what doesn't. So to demonstrate this point, despite this global growth in EVs that we've just talked about, EV media coverage last year was dominated by stories of unsold EVs piling up on dealership lots in America. But the nuance behind these headlines was lost. The US has a very different EV incentive program to Canada, and the study behind it, which was released last summer, didn't include automakers without dealerships like Tesla, which is by far the biggest seller of EVs in North America. So the reality in Canada was that EV sales were high and inventories were comparatively low, but that didn't stop this US report spawning an entire news cycle of coverage that trickled into Canadian op-eds, citing this drop in demand for EVs that undoubtedly impacted public perception of the technology in some way. The media has also served to reinforce some of the common myths around EVs. There's a decent chance you read one headline or another about the Chicago Teslas lining up at public chargers during January's cold snap. But the problem at one location in the US made international headlines for days. And around the same time, there was a study published from Norway where a quarter of the vehicles on the road are electric. It's by far the highest share of EVs on the road anywhere in the world. And this study found that gas and diesel cars experience cold-related starting difficulties nearly twice as often as EVs. And what's more, most of this coverage not only failed to mention that study, but also failed to note that most EV charging actually happens at home, not at public chargers. And it's coverage reminiscent of the many stories that we've probably all seen about EVs bursting into flames, despite the fact that gas cars are 30 to 60 times more likely to catch fire. But perhaps the most persistent narrative of all is that EVs are just too expensive and no one wants them as a result. But our research has shown over and over again that most break even with similar gas cars within only a year or two, and after that, they actually reap considerable savings. So whatever way you look at it, we know EVs aren't a silver bullet solution, but climate change won't be solved without their wide adoption. And so it really is necessary that Canadians are accurately informed about them. So to that end, I'd like to welcome our panelists for today's discussion. I'm joined by Clean Energy Canada's Director of Public Affairs, Joanna Kyriazis, our Communications Director, Trevor Melanson, along with Globe and Mail car critic, Matt Bubbers, and Electric Mobility Canada's Danielle Breton. Hi, everyone.
Hi there.
So firstly, thanks so much for joining us today. I've got a couple of pre-prepared questions that I'm just going to put to the panelists, but after that, I'm going to open the floor to questions. So please drop your questions in the Q&A box and we'll try and get through as many of them as possible. So first of all, I've just got a question for Matt. Do you think, as we've argued, that newsrooms are focusing too much on the downsides of EVs without noting comparable drawbacks for gas cars? And if so, why?
I think this is such an interesting question, and it's something I've thought a lot about as someone covering this. Yeah, what really resonated with me, what you said, I mean, gas cars are slowly heating up the planet. It's terrifying. Like, shouldn't that be the top headline every day in every newspaper? But it's not, and this is something Trevor's wrote too, that it has to do with like the fundamental problem of like the mechanics of journalism. But I also think like human nature, these long-term things are just harder to hold in our head all the time and keep it top of mind all the time. The Guardian has great coverage on this issue. When it comes to the kind of split of coverage between positive and negative, you know, they're not equal, EVs and gas cars. It's not like we're covering two leading political parties here. Like, we know EVs are better. They're not a silver bullet for sure, but like they're going to help with climate change. But they're also still new technology, facing all the new technology problems, facing, you know, new supply chain hurdles. They're having big victories and missteps, and that's all worth covering. There's just a lot more to cover when it comes to EVs. And so, you know, they're like 12% of the new vehicle market share in Canada, ZEVs are. And they're definitely, I haven't got the numbers, but they're way more than 12% of the Globe and Mail's automotive coverage, like by far. You know, there's just a lot more coverage of EVs, which actually is a good thing, you know, getting these out there. And I don't think the problem is too many negative stories. I think the problem is too many bad negative stories. So it's just, you know, there's a lot. Covering negative story issues around EVs is totally legitimate and we should do it. But there's, yeah, been a lot of kind of lazy op-eds, kind of surface level looks, overblown sensational stories, which I've covered a lot in the Globe and Mail. You know, I wrote about how that so-called drop in consumer demand that was kind of widely reported was overblown and more to do with financial issues than EVs themselves. Also, the reliability study that was out there, when you actually, it was so widely, I think it was JD Power, but so widely reported that EVs are less reliable. But when I dug into it, it was kind of the opposite. It showed like a very rosy future for EV reliability. So like the nuance in EV coverage is so important, and it's really just the bad stories that are the problem, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I'm just going to move on for a question for Danielle. So what impact do you think that, you know, as we just discussed, this kind of bad news coverage of EVs has had or will have on EV adoption in Canada? Oh, sorry, Danielle, you're muted.
Sorry. So it does have an impact because, I mean, I hear so many people around me who have known me for decades, who know that I've been talking and working on EVs for decades. They're saying, well, have you heard about this story that EVs pollute more than gas vehicles, you know? And have you heard about this story that, well, in the winter, it's really problematic and that those chargers, you know, they freeze all the time. So people who know me come up to me and ask me these questions because they read it or they see it in the media. And, you know, I remember back in the 80s when, you know, tobacco companies were saying, you know, well, cigarettes are not that bad. You know, there's no proof that they're that bad, you know, for people's health. And in the 90s and 2000s, that oil companies were saying, well, I don't think that there's any link between climate change and oil production, you know. So what I'm seeing right now is that some folks from industry are saying that, well, EVs are not that great. Actually, there are many problems with them. The grid won't hold up. So obviously, this does have an impact for ordinary consumers who get confused. And to me, what I see when I'm talking about misinformation and disinformation, getting the people confused enough is what they're looking for. Because once they're confused, they don't know what to decide. Once they don't know what to decide, they will hold up on buying an electric car. So it does have an impact.
For sure. So, okay, just kind of switching gears a little bit. A question for Joanna. Will this overly negative media make it harder for governments to implement EV-supported policies?
So similar to Danielle, yes, I think it could, right? There's a very close interaction between public opinion and policy. So the Canadian public is electing political leaders who are making decisions on policy. And if voters are feeling much more negatively about EVs, they're less likely to vote for a political leader who champions them. Public opinion also has the ability to push policymakers to act, right? Whether by demanding change or creating urgency. So for instance, when potential EV buyers were getting fed up with the long wait lists that they were coming across when trying to purchase an EV, complaining about it to media was helpful. It helped government prioritize the EV availability standard that was ultimately finalized last year and requires car makers to sell more EVs in Canada. Public opinion can also create space for more ambitious policies because government feels, you know, more confident that its policy decisions will be welcomed or celebrated or validated. And this, you know, is one of the reasons that Quebec, for instance, continuously has an ambitious package of policies when it comes to EVs, regardless of the political leaning of the government of the day. And it's because there's really broad support for EVs in Quebec. So yeah, I wanted to just agree with something that Matt said before, where there's a difference between reporting on legitimate issues that need to be solved, right? Whether it's the still slightly higher upfront cost of EVs or the need for EV readiness requirements in buildings, because these are constructive conversations. They can steer policymakers to advance solutions, like offering consumer EV rebates or updating building codes. But once you start getting, media diving into hyperbole, spreading misinformation or disinformation, I'm seeing, some conversations around the difference between those two things. And then kind of like willingly playing into the culture wars to get more clicks, that really risks politicizing EVs and could cause policymakers to just decide, I don't want to touch these with a 10-foot pole, which would be a huge detriment to many drivers and, of course, to our efforts to combat climate change.
So, I mean, question for Trevor then, of building off that, with all this misinformation circulating social media and in the media generally about EVs and climate solutions broadly, what are some ways that we can break through?
Yeah, no, it's I feel like it's the hardest question. It's hard enough to diagnose a problem. It's even harder to solve one. There's been some talk about misinformation versus disinformation. We use misinformation as a catch-all kind of in this, because I think when we're talking about like media, for example, or some of what's coming from that side of things, it's more in the misinformation camp. It's more like it's coming from people that are often well-intended or not, at least not badly intended. And versus disinformation, it's often coming from, actors who know precisely what they're doing. So there's almost less you can achieve, at least in terms of fixing those issues. But as for how we solve it, that is the tough question. And I'm sure we'll touch on a bunch of ideas throughout this conversation, but I'll start a bit high level. And I'll clarify that I'm speaking more from a perspective of communications as opposed to conversations. So what I mean by that is that you're reaching a lot of people. You're not just speaking to your mother. I think that's a different tactic you would take in that case. I mean, off the top, I think it's generally better to argue in a pro-EV frame as opposed to a defensive one. So, rather than saying, oh, don't worry, only 1 in X EVs catch fire, you don't need to worry about it, as if people can even place that number. You point out that EVs are, as Keri mentioned, 30 to 60 times less likely to catch fire than a gas car, right? Don't just say that EVs are going to get cheaper in the future. Don't worry, just wait. Show how much cheaper they already are when you factor in ownership costs. Argue from a position of strength. Be offensive as opposed to defensive, and I think it's useful to highlight the inadequacies of gas cars as a general point of reference. And the way I say that because people just unthinkingly accept and completely forget about the risks and drawbacks of gas cars.
Absolutely.
Whereas every perceived limitation of an EV is a reservation that they need to stop and think about. So that's what we're fighting against. And it's really important to remember where people are starting from, because it's never an even playing field. And as you're threading this needle, I think, I think someone mentioned earlier, it's important not to alienate people. Basically, if you do that, like words really, it's kind of unavoidable to some extent, like you're going to alienate some people, but you want to make sure that at least most people can get behind what you're saying. So what I mean by that is don't push someone to buy an EV before they're financially ready. So say things like, when you're ready to buy your next car, be sympathetic, especially to the fact that EVs, cost a bit more upfront. And the last point I'll make here is that misinformation, I think, feeds off of motivation. And I think this is an important one, because if someone believes they can't afford an EV because it's too expensive upfront, or because they think you're telling them to buy one this year, they're more likely to believe in misinformation, right? Buying an EV needs to feel accessible and appealing to them. They need to feel like they can do it. Ideally, they need to feel like they want to do that. That's where you need to get first, if you can trigger that. And then everything else they'll be much more receptive to.
Absolutely. Danielle, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, so last year we published a survey at EMC, which was a survey on people's competence or knowledge regarding EVs instead of a survey on perception. And to me, we did that on purpose because we've seen many other surveys, and I'm sure, Joanna, you know exactly what I'm talking about, people's perception of EVs, so they were asked questions. So would you buy an EV? And people are not sure. They say, well, considering the fact that there's not enough chargers, it could have an impact on the grid. So would you buy an EV? So considering that 97% to 98% of Canadians do not drive an EV. So most Canadians don't really know about EV and EV technologies. So what they rely on is bad information, misinformation, and disinformation. So how could it be inclined with all that we're seeing these days when, we hear people from the industry that repeat, well, there's not enough chargers for 2035. And I answered, well, there's not enough chicken for 2035 in Canada for now, and there's not enough houses for 2035. It's ridiculous. But because they keep repeating and repeating and repeating the same old lines, people say, well, my God, there must not be enough chargers. So we asked Canadians what they knew about electric cars, and we found out that they know very little. Actually, the majority of Canadians don't even know that there's an EV rebate in Canada. So we have to come with solutions like knowledge surveys and webinars like this. We have to keep repeating the message over and over and again because you said it. It's not a fair fight, but we have to keep fighting. I'm sorry. All I see is doing stuff like this, working with Joanna, working with you guys, but we have to fight the good fight. But it's a tough one. And I've fought that battle 20 years ago on climate change. Here I am 20 years later fighting on EVs.
I appreciate your fight, Danielle. So I've actually got a question for Matt. It's from an audience question. It's about kind of media specifically. So someone's written, I find there's often a big difference between the content of an article and the headline. I think this is obviously an issue that's very specific to online news. The headline, of course, is all people remember. Matt, how can we get the headlines to match the content? And
Yeah,
I mean,
I think
you might want to weigh in here as well.
This is a great question. And honestly, it's a question we get so often. And I guess a couple things. I just want to explain that like at newspapers, I'm the writer of the story. If my name's on the story, it doesn't mean I've written the headline. So often, usually, always, the editors write the headlines. So, and they have their own reasons for packaging stories however they want to do that. And I often will suggest headlines to my editor who sometimes uses them or sometimes doesn't, but it's important to know that, I think. The second thing is, like, you have to read more than the headline. Headlines don't capture a story. There's a reason stories are like 700 words or 1,000 words, and it goes back to that point I made off the top about nuance. Like, these are complicated issues with a lot of angles, and just glancing at a study or looking at some survey or report, like, that doesn't give you a full picture, and you need to read all the way down in like a good story, not a bad story, to really get the nuance. Like, nuance is hard to write because it's not easy to put in a headline. It doesn't make for a snappy, good headline, but I write stories with nuance anyway, and I hope that readers read past the headline.
And it's certainly not fashionable these days. Nuance, my God.
Well, you get what you pay for with news. I hope. I like to think anyway. So yeah. Did that answer your question? You can feel free to ask a follow-up if you need more info.
No, I think so. I mean, I think this is an issue with the nature of the fact that we all get our news online, and editors and publications are competing for clicks. But so I've actually got a question. I'm just going to change direction a little bit. I'm going to send it to Joanna, but everyone feel free to jump in, because we've had a few questions along this similar vein, so it's good to ask it up front. So how do you respond to the criticism of EVs that all cars, not only EVs, are something we should be moving away from, and EVs are distracting from better solutions?
We like to talk about the fact that EVs are not the only solution to climate change, but are a necessary one. And I think a lot of my responses to questions coming up from the audience here are going to bring up this idea of empathy. I think at least for me and my approach. I do not like to take sort of a holier than thou, dismissive approach. I really like to hear where people are coming from. And I'm someone who hates driving. I love living in cities. You know, I get nervous driving. My goal for life was to never have a car. I have 2 kids now, and I live in Ottawa, where public transit isn't the best. And so I do have a car. Luckily, I was able to get an EV. But I just think of all the people who have to rely on a car, right? Like, especially with housing affordability issues right now, folks are moving further and further away from where they work, and are commuting long distances. Similarly, you know, families are opting to go and stock up at Costco for their groceries instead of swinging past like the local grocery store, which is often more expensive. And so even just from that point of view, Canadians, or at least some Canadians, are going to have to continue to rely on cars. Also, from a timing perspective, and like we've talked about, those cars have to be electric. From a timing perspective as well, you know, public transit is so important. It's a part of the solution. Designing and redesigning our communities to make them more walkable, absolutely a part of the solution, and probably the first, you know, priority when we can make it happen. But I also just think about our time horizon here. You know, we have, what, 10 years left to avert the worst impacts of climate change. Often these large transit projects or community rebuilding projects take a decade to deliver. And so in the meantime, we've got to swap as many gas cars as we can out for electric vehicles and cut our carbon pollution as quickly as we can. Matt wants to chime in.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that this is something I hear a lot also from readers, and it's just, I think the answer is that it's not a zero-sum game, like you were saying, Joanna. Like, it's not either or. We don't have to choose between cars and transit or bicycles and streetcars. Like, it needs to be everything. In the past, it was we kind of only relied on cars, maybe an over-reliance on cars. I think for sure, less cars, especially in downtown cores, are the way a lot of cities around the world are moving. And, you know, I think the focus should just be on moving the most people as fast and efficiently as possible. And the solution for what that looks like in a given area is going to change drastically, whether you live in the country or a city or wherever. So, yeah, Daniel, did you?
Oh, sorry, you're on mute again.
I'm sorry. I actually live in the country. So to me, you know, waiting for the subway or the train or whatever is something that's not going to happen. So as Joanna and you said, you know, it's not an either or. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. So so when we're talking about electric cars, I've been talking about this for a long time. Car sharing and carpooling. We want that because we want less cars on the road, especially in downtown areas, but we want them to be electric. So to me, it's both technology and behavior that we have to work on at the same time. I think that this argument to say, you know, electric cars are an illusion. I've heard that electric cars are an illusion that would keep people driving by themselves in their car. Well, we have to discourage solo driving, encourage car sharing and carpooling. But when you live in rural areas like I do, like many Canadians do, well, electric cars are really, they make a big difference on GHG emissions. And about that, I hear so many times that when you live in rural Canada, you cannot own an EV. That's just plain false for a very simple reason. Because you can, I mean, there are not many towers in Saint-Ignace-de-Loyola where I live, actually none. So most people have either a garage or a driveway, which means that they can install a charger. So for the vast majority of people living in rural Canada, they can buy an EV without any problem because they can charge it at home. Or if they're not confident, they can at least buy a PHEV. So rural Canadian argument against EVs doesn't make sense at all once you know how an EV works.
I also add on this one, like, I think a lot of us who work with climate file maybe feel this way. I certainly do. Like, let's not make this harder this transition harder than it needs to be. It's already hard enough. And, you know, trying to get everybody out of a car in the next 10 years I mean, I moved out of Toronto almost 10 years ago to the day, and I thought the Eglinton line was like on the verge of opening up. And I was back there in the fall, and I'm like, nothing has happened. So I just can't imagine trying to like transform an entire country that way on a short time horizon when they can't even achieve it in Toronto, right? The biggest city in Canada. So, whatever your perspective is on how much transit should or even can meet transportation demand in Canada, you definitely need to hedge it with electric cars, because we don't want to fail at achieving our transportation emission reductions, and we don't have a lot of time to do it.
So how many countries, the most progressive countries, how many of them got rid of cars? 0. None of them. So I'm sorry to say this, but we'll all need cars 10 to 20 years from now. They might as well be electric.
I love this. I love the conversations around you can walk and chew gum at the same time. As a car owner who also much prefers riding her bike as much as possible, you can definitely do both. Both have a car and choose not to use it when possible. Okay, so just to keep the conversation moving forward, I've got a question here that has popped up in a couple of different ways that I think Danielle will like answering. So given that the vast majority of current lithium-ion battery cell production is in China and will be for the next 5+ years while the industry ramps up in North America, how do we counter arguments about the issues with Chinese-made EVs over Western-made ICE vehicles, internal combustion engine vehicles?
I'll say, okay, so the vast majority of cars that are electric are made in China for the Chinese market. They're not made in China for the North American market. So there are a few Chinese cars made in China that are sent to Canada. But the vast majority of cars that we are driving right now, they are not from China. They are from South Korea, from the US, from Japan, and from Europe. If you want to be picky, you can even shop your electric vehicle depending on where the battery comes from, which is one thing that I did when I was looking for my car. The battery came from the US. So this is something that you can shop for, that you can look at. And as time goes by, we all know that we have invested significantly in Canada on battery manufacturing plants, in the US as well. So it means that as time goes by, there will only be more choice of electric cars with batteries coming from North America. So to me, this is not the biggest issue. But one thing that I find is that I'm hearing a lot of the fact that Chinese car manufacturers are going to invade North America. I remember back in the day that, Japanese car manufacturers were coming, like Toyota and Honda and others. They were saying, well, we should buy American. My uncle did the Korean War. So when we decided that we wanted to buy a Japanese car, he was infuriated by the fact that we did not want to buy American. But the fact that affordable gas cars back in the day from Japan were good products. Now they've taken over. After that, it was the Korean car manufacturers. People were laughing at the Korean car manufacturers. Now they're good companies. Hyundai and Kia make amazing electric cars, and they're now the third largest manufacturer of cars in the world is Hyundai. So if the Chinese car manufacturer come to North America because they are willing to offer affordable electric cars, because right now, American car manufacturers are not providing affordable electric cars, that might be something that they have to look at. So I think that is competition that we have to think about, but we want as many people driving electric cars as possible. If possible, American cars, but if not, right now, American car manufacturers can't even produce affordable gas cars. So it's going to be a challenge for them.
So, sorry, yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I'm actually curious what Joanna, I wanted to kind of hear Joanna respond to this actually, because it is something that I've been thinking about a lot, talking to people I talk to in the auto industry. I know they're thinking about kind of the threat from China. And I think we sitting here should also remember, though, that this is about workers. Like, this is about
Absolutely.
jobs for Canadian workers who, the auto industry is so huge in Southern Ontario, and so many people's livelihoods depend on it. The government is putting so much money into it right now. And, you know, you don't want that to go to waste with just an influx of cars made by people elsewhere, non-union jobs, low pay. Like, so I think there is, and I'm sure policymakers are looking at this, some protectionist measures that maybe need to happen in Canada to protect from the influx of either Chinese-made EV batteries or the minerals or the full cars themselves. But yeah, I'm curious what, you know, from a policy standpoint, Joanna's take on this.
Sure. So yeah, I think from a climate and a consumer standpoint, Chinese EVs offer a lot of benefits, right? Or Chinese EVs and their parts. So China has had a massive head start here. They are producing EVs and critical minerals and everything in between at scale. And so if one of the big barriers to going electric is affordability concerns, Chinese EVs and their parts can help with that, can help deliver more affordable EVs to Canadians. And again, you know, so from a consumer standpoint and from the climate standpoint, that helps to speed up the transition and cut car pollution. Like, you know, an example is I was listening to a podcast on sort of the US IRA, and it was a bunch of modelers looking at how did their projections for different clean energy solutions uptake for the year 2023 go. And when it came to solar, uptake of solar, you know, either met or surpassed their expectations. When it came to wind underperformed. Part of that is because where the supply chains are. The wind power supply chain is more North American or American and wasn't able to kind of keep up with the demand. And so, you know, so from that point of view, I think there's some benefits. Of course, though, right? We want Canada and North America to be positioned to reap as many economic benefits as we can from this transition. And I just think that Canadian and American governments are putting in like Herculean efforts here to try to do that. And Canada's really punching above our weight. Like when you look at the dollar amounts of investments that we've attracted into our EV battery supply chain, we're, I think, hovering around 40 billion here. The US is not so much more. I think it's 90 billion, right? That's not a 10%. That's a 30%, 33%. We've got like 3 battery gigafactories when we thought we might be able to land 1. So yeah, I really think that we're positioned to do well. And then last, from a worker standpoint, I have just loved watching Unifor's approach and comparing and contrasting it to the UAW in the US. Unifor has been so supportive of EVs. They were very proactive in their collective bargaining strategies to make sure that, you know, they secured those EV investments and they're getting protections for their workers. Whereas in the UAW, or in the US, the UAW has taken a more adversarial approach, is resisting the transition. So anyways, I think we have all the ingredients that we need, and we're really set as Canadians to do better in the EV transition than our auto sector would have done without it.
Yeah, we'd be in big trouble if the Canadian government had not decided to invest in the EV manufacturing. I mean, there wouldn't be an auto industry between now and 2035 in Canada. I'm pretty convinced of that.
For sure. So I'm just going to move the discussion on here, and I'm going to send this question to Trevor, but again, feel free to jump in. So we've had some questions about the carbon footprint or the environmental and social impacts of mining related to EVs. Can you just speak to some examples of how you can speak to people or communicate around this issue? Because I know it's can be quite a contentious one when it comes to the switch to EVs.
Yeah, you know, most people do believe that EVs are cleaner overall. I mean, the polling that I've seen on that. So you do have like that's a popular, bit of misinformation that swirls around. The majority of Canadians do generally think that EVs are cleaner, but probably not as many as you'd like, and they may not fully appreciate the degree to which they're cleaner. I think, I mean, we always point out, first of all, that EVs are cleaner everywhere, no matter where you drive. So just kind of remove that ambiguity. So it's just like, let people know that, like, look, buying an EV is a good thing no matter where you live. And then you can make the point, people don't realize that Canada's electricity grid is like 84% non-emitting, very unknown fact. I mean, but again, you say, well, yeah, think about how much hydroelectricity we have, and obviously some nuclear in Ontario and a bit of renewables. But then people go, oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, there's tons of hydro in Canada. Okay. And it's going to be different in different provinces. So, I think a lot of it is electricity generation is the less complicated side to speak to. Than mining. We had this EV myth busting video we put out a few months ago that did tackle this, and focusing on the electricity grid is one of the things. I think one of the points that is important to make, and probably it's a harder one to make quickly, is that it is about the emissions footprint of the car you're buying, but it's not just about that. It's also about enabling the transition, right? So, by buying an EV, you're helping scale up economies of scale. You're helping EVs take over. At the same time as EVs are scaling up and more people are buying them, we're also transitioning our electricity system, right? So whenever there's this study that looks at the carbon footprint of an EV, if that study has not actually factored in how the electricity grid powering that EV is going to change over time and instead is relying on historical data, that's a big flaw, because that car is going to get cleaner over time as the electricity grid gets clean. And the same thing, even in the production of an EV, a lot of someone correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think a lot of the emissions actually come from fossil fuel use in sort of mining or transportation in the supply chain. So like the culprit is still fossil fuels, right? Like people are pretending, oh, the EV car isn't, better in all these ways than a gas car. But actually, when you get to like where some of those emissions are coming from, even on the production side, it's still the culprit is still fossil fuels. So I think, drawing attention to that fact and helping people, I think we have more work to help people understand that, yes, it's about emissions. If you're in Canada or pretty much anywhere, an EV is cheaper everywhere, and it's going to get cleaner everywhere, and it's going to get cleaner over time. But it's like casting a ballot. Like you're doing your part to enable that transition by getting a car that's a part of this whole energy transition that uses clean electricity, that's going to clean up its supply chains. You're being a part of that, right? There's no solving climate change with like, a fossil fuel that's only 50% less bad, right? People need to understand the difference between truly decarbonizing versus not decarbonizing.
Two quick things I'd like to add to what Trevor just said. When you buy an electric car, as time goes by, the vehicle gets cleaner because the grid gets cleaner. A gas car, as time goes by, the vehicle gets dirtier because its anti-pollution system gets dirtier, less efficient, and the vehicle pollutes a lot more. So this is very important that people don't seem to realize this. Anti-pollution system, when it's brand new, it's very efficient. After 5 to 10 years, it becomes very inefficient. And not to mention the fact that 90% of oil in Canada is oil sands. So as we move forward with less and less regular oil and more oil sands and more and more shale oil, actually it means that the life cycle of the light duty vehicle or the life cycle of oil in North America is getting dirtier because we're moving it to unconventional oil as well.
I just wanted to add that EVs have an enormous advantage when it comes to the total life cycle emissions, and that's recycling. Like all of the minerals, the batteries for EVs are a really big emitter. It does take a lot of carbon to get those materials, package them, transport them all over the world, put them in these packs. But the great news is that you can actually get a lot of those materials back out and either, at the end of life, or let's say it doesn't have enough range left to like be useful in a car anymore. You can package those battery packs and have like a second life for them before you even recycle those minerals, which, you know, you can't, nobody's like recycling the carbon that's coming out of a car's tailpipe right now. But it's also another industry for Canada. Like if Canada can ramp up, there's a few companies locally starting to do EV battery recycling, extracting those minerals and reusing them. It could be another good story for Canadian industry and Canadian workers. So yeah, I think that's, now that I'm hearing about it, maybe we still need to bust this myth even more. I thought it had kind of been busted, but I guess we'll keep doing it. Joanna?
Well, and I just want to jump off that. I also have noticed that projections of how much mineral demand recycling is going to meet just keep getting better and better. So I used to have, you know, folks from the mining sector say, oh, we're talking about maybe 2% of raw material demand can be offset by 2040 or 2050. Now we've got S&P Global Mobility saying 20% of global cobalt and nickel demand for EVs is going to be met by recycled sources by 2032. Like that's a decent chunk, and it's only going to get better. And as you said, you know, the carbon from the tailpipe's not getting recycled, and certainly the oil that is going into the vehicles, not just in their manufacture, their initial manufacture, but through their entire life, that's not recyclable.
Like quickly, just Bill, I was saying Matt was saying, because it inspired me, that question, I feel like I was giving more factual answers, and I want to give a bit of a communications one. And I had a bit of an insight when Matt was talking about recycling, and it's this word waste. It's actually a great word because, you know, I've been in focus groups and done polling on this. Waste is a very powerful word for people because you don't need to explain it to them. They just hate it off the bat, right? We've got decades of being sort of, we all know that we should recycle. We all know, you know, littering is terrible. You just don't need to tell people that waste is bad. Emissions, well, that's a little intellectual. I may not actually understand that. And so I think, you know, battery recycling is a great one, but there's also ways to talk about EVs and it being less wasteful, right? Like gas cars waste way more energy than EVs. So I think, you know, we did this other, like biofuels, for example, hold terribly. Just the word biofuel just tanks like really low. But when you talk about turning like RNG, renewable natural gas, like turning waste products into natural gas, like turning waste into something, a fuel, it pulls incredibly well. Like it's just an inverse. Same with energy efficiency. When you talk about reducing energy waste, you can get people more engaged. So waste is, even though it may not seem like a perfectly precise word at all times to talk about EVs, where it's appropriate, it's probably a pretty evocative word for people that maybe don't quite understand the technical concepts.
Also, just EVs last longer, you know, so you don't need to make as many of them if they last longer. Sorry, that's just another thought.
I mean, his point about waste, you know, I mean, you waste about 300 to 400 times more natural resources with gas cars than electric cars. To me, that speaks volumes.
For sure. Okay, so I'm just going to ask a question about plug-in hybrids because I feel like they're having a bit of a moment right now. For some reason, plug-in hybrids have been making a lot of headlines recently as the sort of antidote to the supposed drop in demand for EVs. So someone's asked, can you speak to the role of PHEVs in the transition to EVs? I found that most people with concerns around taking the leap to a full EV are more than happy to buy a plug-in hybrid as a first step. Will this result in enough emissions reductions? I don't know if anyone wants to take that question, so I'll leave it open.
You want to go, Joanna?
Yeah, Joanna, go.
Go ahead, Joanna.
Want me to go? So plug-in hybrid. Can I just say I'm seeing in the chat some requests for us to post. We don't have access as panelists to post, so either you'll receive a recording of this with the stats, or please just reach out to Clean Energy Canada's info email, and I'm happy to respond to you with some of these facts. So plug-in hybrids, what role do they play? I mean, I think they're generally seen to be a bit of a transition vehicle for the folks that are too hesitant to go fully battery electric, in theory. But if you look at sales trends, PHEVs have hardly moved over the last 5 years. Like battery electric vehicles are seeing an exponential rise. Nobody's really buying PHEVs. And I think it's because while they're supposed to be the best of both worlds, they're actually the worst of both worlds. Number one, my understanding is they'll never reach cost parity because the manufacturers need to be investing in both powertrains, or like the facility processes that produce both powertrains. From a consumer convenience perspective, you've got to be worried about plugging in and so like recharging your battery and hitting the gas station. So I don't actually know if they're going to take off. I see them as a bit of a psychological safety thing that's there for consumers who want to try it out. But in many ways, I think they might just get leapfrogged because once you experience even the battery electric version or side of a PHEV, you realize it's so great that you just want to drive fully electric all the time.
I would only add to that though, like totally agree with you. And I know that Keri put up that chart earlier that showed, because again, they have 2 powertrains. They're actually, EVs are way lower fire risk than gas cars, but hybrids were coming at the top and more maintenance issues and stuff. Having said that, like, you know, I've taken, I'm sure you have, Joanna, too, like radio interviews in places like Yellowknife. When I'm talking to Yellowknife, it's probably a little easier to sell people on a PHEV than an EV. So I think, especially because Canada's such a big rural place, there are some areas, again, very low population density. Most people do not live in these areas. You should just go straight for a BEV. But there are going to be those edge case areas in Canada. We are a unique country in that regard where they make some sense, I think.
So can I say something?
Yep, go ahead.
So about PHEVs, so let's face it, they are a lot less efficient than people make them to be, especially when they're fleet vehicles, because a lot of people just don't plug them. That's the first thing. The second thing, PHEVs, when it's really cold outside, they just run on gas. You can have a full battery, but it's only going to be the gas engine that's going to run, because the vast majority of PHEVs have a threshold that's at -15, the gas engine will start. So in cold climate like ours, it is not a great solution, but I understand the fact that some people are worried about range. They will want to buy a PHEV. I am actually shopping right now for a PHEV for my mother, who's 87 years old, because I'm afraid that sometimes she will forget to plug it. So to me, it does make sense. But as technology evolves, you have to keep in mind that between 2012 and now, EV range has tripled, while PHEV range has basically stayed approximately the same. But if you're looking at data, let's say, I'll give you an example. In 2018 in Quebec, the majority of people bought PHEVs, 55%. If you look at last fall, we were at 2 battery electric vehicles for 1 PHEV. If you're looking at Norway, the data from January 2024, there were 92% BEV sales for 2% PHEV sales. So I think this is the future. Few PHEVs.
Yeah,
I just wanted to add, like, I don't know. I feel a bit differently on PHEVs. I'm like, cars are such a personal thing for people. If it feels like it's gonna suit your lifestyle and it's more affordable than a full EV, you know, go for it. I think it is kind of a gateway to getting a full EV in the future. Canadians don't keep their cars that long on average. So, you know, I think it actually does work as a path to, you know, greening the car fleet. But part of the new federal ZEV sales mandate, the availability standard, they're calling it, it does give full credits to PHEVs above 80 kilometers of electric only range, and they're capped in a number of credits, or the percentage of credits that they can get for PHEVs, car companies. So, but the problem is, I think, and why some analysts I speak to are kind of pretty lukewarm or cold on PHEVs in the midterm, is that not many PHEVs can hit that 80 kilometers of electric only driving range. And because of the timeline of that ZEV sales mandate, it takes car companies a lot of years, like 5 years or sometimes more, 4 years, to develop a new PHEV, and they're not going to be able to get those longer range PHEVs to market before they're kind of less useful for some of these federal availability
But Matt,
standards.
between us, the government has been talking about putting together a ZEV mandate, you know, the federal government back in 2020, 2021. So if we're talking 2020, 6 years, that's 2026, which is the first year of the mandate. So car manufacturers were aware that the government wanted to do it, but some of them were in denial, hoping that it would not come through. So now they're saying, well, we're being caught off guard. No, 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 no. You heard about it for years. So don't come to us saying it's going to take us 6 years once everything has been adopted. And now they're hoping that if another government comes in, they'll just scrap the mandate. So that's where we are.
Yeah, no, I think you misunderstood there. I was just saying that's why I don't think you will see PHEVs take off or be as important. It's because they don't quite match with the regulations. But you know, obviously EVs can get there, and car companies do still get some partial credits for PHEVs below the 80-kilometer threshold. So we're getting really into the weeds here.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, I mean, I'd also seen some studies that show that the plug-in hybrids are some of the least reliable because you've got 2 powertrains to maintain as well. But anyway, I'm just because we're running out of time, there's been so many questions, we can't get through them all. So I'm just, with 2 minutes left, I'm gonna kind of pitch a higher level comms-based question to hopefully kind of wrap things up. So in your experience, what consumer concerns are legitimate regarding EVs and what concerns are overblown by the media, and how does one critically and honestly address the real concerns that potential buyers may have? And then, yeah, I mean, there's also been a kind of another question, which I'm going to tie into that, which is recognizing that EVs are sprinkled with misinformation. How can proponents of EVs communicate EV adoption while factually acknowledging the limitations? So basically, how can we address the concerns while also speaking about the realities and also the benefits? And yeah, Trevor, do you want to kick it off?
Sure. Think about it. I think the two that are sort of true, you know, or have a degree of truth in them and need to be addressed, and they're also the two that in polling come to the top, like are at the top of people's concerns. One is the upfront cost of an EV. You know, they are more expensive. And 2 is public charging. So I think those are the 2 areas where the criticism is kind of the most valid. Like, yes, that EV may save you money over time, but you know, debt has gotten more expensive. So financing has gotten more expensive. EVs have kind of been, you know, flat, or in some cases come down a little bit, but for the most part, you know, everything is mid-40s and up that's on the market. You're not, you know, seeing many $30,000 cars. So, you know, somebody may not have just may not be able to finance an electric vehicle, or can't wait for the payback period, or that would put them over a debt limit that would compromise what they get approved for in a mortgage or something like that, right? Like not everybody's in a perfect financial condition to take on more debt. So I think that definitely we do need to see upfront costs come down, and that's a valid concern. And it's on automakers, getting back to like Chinese EVs and why maybe they're not such a bad thing. We need some pressure. It always seems to be Tesla who has to do it to move the market. Maybe that's what it will be again. And then public charging, yeah, I mean, it is like, again, unless you're driving a Tesla, it's kind of a problem. And there's work to be done there. And again, I think we always emphasize, like, yes, public charging could be better, but look, for most people, you're never going to use it, or you're barely going to use it, right? So long as you have a garage, you really don't need to be too worried about this, because it's pretty rare that you're ever going to rely on it. So I think, you know, you can speak to the issue, but then actually remind people how they use their car, and if they have a garage. And I'll admit though, it is like, if you live in a condo in Thunder Bay that's not, you know, set up for an EV, or your Strata's resistant, yeah, that's, you know, it isn't as easy for you as, you know, the Tesla driver in downtown Vancouver, right? So, you know, you need to be honest about these things. And that's why, especially on like, MERB charging is an area that we actually just need to make progress on. Like we're not nailing it. It's not where it needs to be.
MERBs being like condos, multi-unit residential buildings. Yeah. Okay, we're over time. Does anyone want to wrap this up in 30 seconds? Anyone want to weigh in that question?
Joanna, you go first.
I'll just say empathize and let's talk about the solutions. So let's call out what needs to be fixed and then let's talk about how we fix it.
Love that. Anyone else? Last very, very brief remarks.
Sure, just that, negative stories about EVs are okay. They're important. They're helpful, but bad negative stories about EVs are bad. So just make sure you're reading past the headline, read the nuance, read stories that have nuance, and yeah, it'll happen. Dan?
I would say start with the facts. Just start with the facts. I mean, when I publish something on Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter, I always post the link so that people can verify if what I'm saying is true or not. But many false stories, they have no link. They have nothing. Just even false images of little children who are moving apparently cobalt, but it's bricks, stuff like that. It's crazy. So just start with the facts.
I also just want to weigh in and say, if you drive an EV, talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors about it. Like the network effect is, I think, one of the best ways to get people engaged in this. Don't necessarily have to listen to us, but chat with your friends and family and talk about it and your experiences. Anyway, so yeah, I think that's all we've got time for today. I'm really sorry if we didn't get to your question. We had a huge number of them. So yeah, we'll send a follow-up email shortly with some resources, a recording of the webinar, and also a short survey. So we'd love your thoughts and feedback. But yeah, that's it from us. And wherever you are, have a great rest of your day. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Everyone.